What if the very blow meant to break a nation ended up becoming the spark that turned it into a rising superpower? They predicted it would bring India to its knees within months. Financial experts on Wall Street had already started drafting gloomy forecasts about the collapse of the Indian economy. International newspapers and television channels filled their reports with images of mass unemployment, shuttered factories, and long food queues. Yet only 9 months later, something remarkable happened that no one in the global economic circle had truly expected. The same country that was supposed to crumble under pressure was successfully launching new space programs, opening alternative trade routes, and even building ties with nations that had once been considered adversaries. What began as an attempt to weaken India ended up setting the foundation for its rise as the next great world power. And the surprising twist in this entire journey challenges what most people think they know about global economic strategies. When former US President Donald Trump imposed a massive 50% tariff on Indian exports, followed by another 25% penalty because India chose to keep buying oil from Russia, the world took notice. This was not just routine trade bargaining or temporary posturing. It was a deliberate act of economic hostility on a scale rarely seen in modern history. Overnight, everything from Indian handmade crafts to furniture, from premium teas to fresh seafood, suddenly became far more expensive for American buyers. The numbers spoke for themselves. More than $87 billion worth of Indian goods sold annually in the United States were suddenly at risk. Thousands of factories and millions of manufacturing jobs in India faced the danger of disappearing. Economists warned that the country's GDP might shrink by up to 4 percentage points in the 2025-2026 financial year alone. On paper, it looked like a knockout punch, but India responded differently. Rather than retaliating with its own tariffs or making threats of diplomatic backlash, Prime Minister Narendra Modi chose a path that stunned the international political community. Calm and composed, he unveiled one of the most carefully crafted economic countermeasures the modern world had ever seen. The first step of this plan was aimed inward. Modi brought new energy to an old Indian idea, Atmanirbhar Bharat, meaning self-reliance. This wasn't a recycled slogan or empty speech-making. It was a serious roadmap for transforming India's economic model. Tax breaks and financial support were directed toward local companies. Domestic businesses received stronger backing than ever before to modernize and expand operations. Media campaigns flooded television, social platforms, and billboards, urging citizens to choose Indian-made products with a sense of national pride. Here was where the brilliance of the plan became clear. While Trump thought he was punishing India, Modi recognized it as an unexpected opportunity. For decades, India's economy had been far too dependent on access to the American market. Now, the tariffs provided a valid excuse to change direction. Instead of focusing energy on retaliation, India used the crisis as a moment of reinvention. Exporters were given a clear message: stop looking only toward the United States and broaden your horizons. Suddenly, Indian companies were no longer solely focused on buyers in New York, Los Angeles, or Chicago. They were actively courting customers in Shanghai, Jakarta, São Paulo, and Lagos. This shift was not random at all. It was planned with precision. India started weaving a brand new web of international trade partnerships designed to diversify its risks and strengthen its position in the global economy. Chinese households started welcoming Indian clothing and textiles. African nations turned to India for digital infrastructure and affordable telecom technology. Countries across Latin America began importing Indian farm goods, spices, and machinery. The Middle East expanded its reliance on Indian-made medicine, industrial products, and chemicals. What had first seemed like a devastating export crisis slowly transformed into a golden chance to redistribute India's economic influence. While American shoppers now faced higher bills when buying Indian goods, other parts of the world were enjoying greater access to high-quality Indian products at competitive rates. Instead of losing revenue, India was redirecting it. What looked like damage was actually diversification, and this adaptability became one of India's most powerful economic strengths. But the most surprising consequence of Trump's tariffs was not economic at all, it was diplomatic. For decades, India and China had a bitter relationship filled with mistrust, military standoffs, and constant rivalry. Many analysts around the world had written that the two Asian giants were destined to remain enemies rather than allies. Yet Trump's strong support for Pakistan and his constant criticism of India's economic policies forced New Delhi to rethink its position. Suddenly, Beijing did not appear as the most urgent danger in the region. In fact, Chinese cooperation seemed more useful than hostility in a world where American leadership had started to look unreliable. Behind the scenes, away from media coverage, India and China quietly began talking. There were no grand announcements or dramatic peace treaties. Instead, there were discreet and pragmatic discussions between leaders and diplomats from both sides. The aim was not friendship or sentiment, it was practicality. Both nations recognized that collaboration might serve them better than confrontation. China wanted access to India's massive consumer market and skilled workforce. India could benefit from Chinese financing, advanced manufacturing equipment, and well-established supply chains. Ironically, the very tariffs that were supposed to divide the world ended up nudging two of its biggest economies toward a cautious partnership. While these delicate diplomatic maneuvers were unfolding, India also launched the most ambitious wave of infrastructure development in its modern history. These weren't just ordinary construction projects. They were bold undertakings that would reshape the country's economic geography for generations. The Zojila Tunnel in the Himalayas, for example, is more than just a road. It is a lifeline that ensures year-round connectivity between Kashmir and Ladakh, regions that were once cut off during harsh winters. It represents not only engineering brilliance, but also national integration and vital military access in one of the most sensitive areas of the world. Meanwhile, in Uttar Pradesh, the new Jewar airport is being built to rival some of the busiest airports across the globe, from Dubai International to Singapore's Changi. This isn't just another place for planes to land. It is designed to be a global gateway for trade, travel, and logistics, capable of handling millions of passengers and enormous amounts of cargo each year. At the same time, Gujarat's GIFT City emerged as India's strategic answer to Singapore's financial hub and Hong Kong's market ecosystem. This is not a project of vanity skyscrapers. It is being developed as a modern financial nerve center where global banks, fintech startups, and trading companies can operate under cutting-edge digital regulations and technology-friendly policies. Perhaps the boldest of all India's ventures is in outer space. The Indian Space Research Organisation announced plans to establish its own independent space station by 2035. This is not simply about placing another object in orbit. It is about entering the elite circle of nations that control space infrastructure. At present, only China has a fully independent station. While the International Space Station remains a shared global effort, India's ambition is to lead its own program. The stakes are huge. Satellite networks influence telecommunications, weather forecasting, GPS systems, and even national defense. By aiming to dominate this arena, India is signaling that it intends to be a leading technological, military, and commercial space power. Each of these infrastructure projects serves a double purpose. On one hand, they absorb a massive share of India's workforce, including those who might have been left jobless after reduced trade with the United States. On the other hand, they prepare India to attract foreign investors, international travelers, and global industries that operate beyond the reach of American trade restrictions. The psychological impact of Trump's tariffs inside India was initially heavy. People genuinely worried about unemployment, slower economic growth, and international isolation. But the Modi government skillfully transformed this fear into determination. The national message was clear. India's destiny would not depend on the goodwill of any single nation. Indian firms started pouring money into research and development. The possibility of losing US buyers became a push for innovation. Manufacturing not only expanded in scale, but also advanced in quality. Companies upgraded technology, improved global standards, and boldly entered new industries with international potential. What began as an apparent setback slowly revealed itself as the turning point of an economic transformation. India was no longer a nation waiting for foreign approval. It was on its way to building a self-reliant, diversified, and globally respected identity, one that no tariff could take away. India was not only surviving, it was steadily transforming. Educational institutions quickly understood the shift. Universities across the nation began offering specialized courses focused on world trade strategy, market diversification, and international relations. Students were studying African buying habits, Latin American trade rules, and Middle Eastern business manners. They were not just memorizing theories, they were learning practical skills made for global commerce. The technology sector, which had long depended heavily on American clients, shifted direction. Indian IT companies that once served almost only Silicon Valley began building products for European banks, Asian transport networks, and African online marketplaces. They were designing solutions for the whole world. This wide response, stretching from diplomatic adjustments to industrial renewal, from new infrastructure to academic reform, was not random. It was carefully planned, almost like a well-coordinated orchestra, and it changed the direction of India's future permanently. Meanwhile, Trump's tariffs were producing results inside the United States that few had expected. Shoppers began facing higher prices for goods they had always bought cheaply. Indian restaurants struggled with rising costs for ingredients. Fashion stores found it hard to keep sourcing fairly priced Indian fabrics. The economic pain did not stop at India's borders, it was spreading through American supply chains. US businesses that had built strong ties with Indian partners found themselves in trouble. Some tried to absorb the extra expenses, cutting into their own profits. Others had to increase prices for customers, making their products less appealing in an already crowded market. Several companies began to look for new suppliers, but breaking long-term partnerships with Indian firms turned out to be much harder and costlier than expected. Indian suppliers had won their position through trust, good pricing, and steady quality. Switching meant starting over, testing unproven supply chains, and often ending up with higher costs and weaker quality. Yet, this was exactly the time when India's strategy revealed its true skill. Instead of celebrating America's economic troubles or trading insults, Indian leaders chose calm professionalism. They showed disappointment but avoided direct fights, speaking instead of hope for future cooperation. This balanced tone won India a lot of respect worldwide. By refusing to look petty or vengeful, India looked like a responsible and steady global actor. Observers across the world noticed. While Trump came across as aggressive and focused only on short-term wins, India seemed patient and smart, an approach that carried weight in diplomatic and economic spaces. This new reputation became one of India's biggest advantages as it worked to form fresh partnerships and join new trade talks. The European Union started reconsidering its trade priorities. African nations deepened their business ties with Indian firms. Southeast Asian countries opened discussions about wider cooperation with India. Even America's closest allies began thinking about whether Trump's hostile style was leaving the door open for them to work more closely with India. The changing mood was clear. Nations were realizing that India was no longer just a regional power. It was a steady and forward-looking partner on the global stage. China's reaction stood out as well. Though it kept a public face of neutrality, Chinese companies quietly grew their presence in India. Among consumers, interest in Indian goods kept climbing. Trade between the two countries expanded, especially in areas that had not seen much exchange before, signaling a quiet but important turning point. But India's changes were not only about trade or politics. Its cultural reach grew alongside its economic rise. Indian films started winning audiences in places where Bollywood was almost unknown before. Indian food became popular in countries where it had never been mainstream. Designers from India began gaining recognition in world fashion markets beyond Europe and America. Indian culture was becoming a form of soft power, opening doors in both diplomacy and trade. Education exchanges also rose sharply. Indian universities welcomed more students from countries that were turning into key business partners. Young people from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America came to India to study medicine, engineering, business, and political science. At the same time, Indian students went to universities in places that had once seemed outside their reach, such as Brazil, Kenya, Vietnam, and Chile. These moves were not just personal choices. They reflected a deeper change in how India saw its place in the worldwide exchange of knowledge. If you are still following along, you are someone who values true global insight. Now, let's focus on perhaps the strongest part of India's overall strategy, its commitment to the long game. Trump's economic moves were designed for quick wins and short-term gains. India, however, was planting seeds for results that could last generations. Each element, whether infrastructure, trade, diplomacy, or cultural growth, was part of a vision built to last beyond political cycles. The ISRO space program was not simply about catching up with leading powers. Its plans stretched to 2040 and further. Infrastructure projects were not only political showcases. They were built as deep investments for the next 50 years of India's growth. Trade deals were not stopgap solutions. They were strong partnerships designed to hold through shifting governments and alliances. This difference in approach became impossible to miss. While the American path under Trump looked reactive and transactional, India's path looked steady, thoughtful, and long-sighted. Global financial markets responded. International investors began seeing India as a safe place for long-term growth. Major credit rating agencies noted India's calm and careful handling of the crisis. Development banks worldwide increased funding for Indian infrastructure projects, seeing them as reliable investments for the future. By early 2025, the results of India's plan were visible to everyone. Trade with non-American partners had grown in a big way. Infrastructure building created jobs and boosted local economies. Diplomatic ties improved across all continents. But perhaps most importantly, India proved something powerful to the world, that a direct economic attack could be turned into a chance for national progress and international presence. Rather than bending under pressure, India became stronger. It opened new trade routes, grew its manufacturing, reformed its education systems, and stepped into global discussions, not as a follower, but as a main voice. The question was no longer whether India could withstand Trump's tariffs. The real question was whether the United States could afford to keep pushing away a nation of such importance. India's reaction showed that economic battles do not always give the attacker the outcome they want, especially against a country with vision, unity, and patience to think decades ahead. Trump might have aimed to weaken India's bargaining power and return America to top control. Instead, he may have sped up India's rise as a global leader. Sometimes the strongest form of resistance is not fighting back directly, but transforming yourself. By choosing not to respond with anger, but with steady building and precision, India created a model that may guide world strategy for years to come. India's management of Trump's trade moves will be studied in business schools, universities, and diplomatic offices long into the future. It is a lesson on how to turn hardship into strength and crisis into growth. What we are seeing is not just the economic rise of one country, it is the rise of a new way of global engagement, a way where patience beats aggression, where planning beats impulse, and where long vision wins over short benefit. At the heart of this changing global picture, India is not standing in the background. It is leading from the front.